Anne, you take us on a journey with Ayn Rand from her birth in pre-revolution Russia, through the revolutionary years to America, Hollywood movies, New York, publishing, fiction, nonfiction, to her final days in an established biographical form. So I found it fascinating that as the introduction to your chapter titled Freedom to Think, you quote Ayn Rand thus: "When I am questioned about myself, I am tempted to say, paraphrasing Roerich, don't ask me about my family, my childhood, my friends, or my feelings. Ask me about what I think," end quote. This was written, by the way, to the readers of her Fountainhead in 1945. Yet, Anne, you chose this quote as an opening to a chapter where you wrote not only about the things she thought and her early work in meeting with Cecil B. DeMille, of course, but you also wrote and opined about precisely the things she didn't think to be explored: her family, her childhood, her friends, and her feelings, including the personal story of her and her husband-to-be, in the very same chapter. So the juxtaposition of your quote at the beginning and the content made me curious as to why you put those two things together.
Well, one answer is that I wanted that quote to be toward the front of the book, because I just love Ayn Rand's description of herself in that quote. But the other reason, the chapter Freedom to Think begins with Ayn Rand getting off the boat in New York Harbor in a light snowfall and seeing the skyline of New York, which she had seen in films and maybe in opera, and which she absolutely loved as the expression of American productivity, American engineering genius, and American aspiration. And it ends with close to the production of Ayn Rand's first play, the night of January 16th, on Broadway in New York in 1934. And during this time, Ayn Rand really leaves her family behind. And she devotes herself to thinking through her past in Russia in a way that is pointed toward, for one thing, her future. She wants to be a novelist. And for another, the revelation of the meaning of communism, according to her lights. So I wanted it to be clear at the beginning that I thought that Ayn Rand's life affected her work, even as she was deciding that it didn't, and that it didn't matter so much.
Answer. Good answer. Now, Mimi, getting directly to Atlas Shrugged, I was very fascinated that you write in your Manifesto of the Mind that when you lecture on and teach that novel, you suggest to readers that they can approach it in several different ways: as a mystery or detective story, as science fiction, as a female fantasy or feminist fable, as alternative reality, and so on. Why do you do this?
Well, I'm a literature teacher, and any literature that has staying power has got more than one level of meaning. And Ayn Rand herself authenticated my approach. She talked about the layers and the levels of meaning. Tiers, she called them. But as I said before, we began this whole thing with a women's studies course, so the feminist fantasy level. And that's also authenticated by when Nathaniel Branden quotes in his book about the fact that he said to Ayn Rand when she was writing the book, "Why is there only one woman and all these men?" And she said, "This is my fantasy." And so that, and there's just so much in the book that pertains to feminism, because for me, feminism, I was also very active in civil rights movements, different civil rights movements, and I'm very much a fan of what Martin Luther King said, and that is that people should be evaluated by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, and I always, pardon me, Dr. King, I add, and by their indoor or outdoor plumbing. So, so I think that it's very important in that way, but also there's so many other tiers or levels to the novel. And of course the mystery story begins with the question, who is John Galt? And so much of the novel then is answering that question. Then there's also, I talk about the Arthurian romance. And this is an archetype, you know, that, well, we have it in the Seven Samurai. There's a different literature that same thing about a group that comes to save a town or to save, in this case, to save the country. So it's not just John Galt, but it's the group of people that he has with him. And that sort of Arthurian theme is there when Dagny is in Galt's Gulch and she is sitting there with all the other great men around her, and they talk about, you know, their plans for the future. So if a novel has that kind of lasting quality, it's going to have those different levels. And I quote, in my book, I quote John Steinbeck when he was talking about The Grapes of Wrath. And he said, there are 5 levels to this book, and the reader is entitled to as many as he or she has in them. And I feel the same way about Atlas Shrugged. You can read it at so many different levels.
One time when I was first in New York, there used to be places called the Blarney Stone, if any of you ever remember those places. And I was very young, and I loved their corned beef and cabbage. And I went in to have lunch there, and there was this guy, this blue-collar worker, who was sitting at the bar, and he was having a whiskey with his lunch, and he was reading Atlas. So I walked up to him and I said, "Oh, you're reading Atlas Shrugged." He said, "Oh, it's a great train story."